Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to Winning the Challenger Sale, where we help you win the sales moments that matter. If you're new to the podcast, let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Andy Harris, the host of Winning the Challenger Sale and the CEO of Challenger. Challenger's research backed sales methodology empowers sellers across the world to create better sales experiences for their clients. This is now our fourth season of Winning the Challenger Sale, and we're kicking it off this year with a very important question. Why aren't you winning? And specifically today, we're double clicking on customer indecision. We see in the data that somewhere between 40 and 60% of deals today end up lost to customers who express their intent to purchase, but ultimately fail to act. Here to break this down for us and provide a better path forward is Ted McKenna. Ted is a partner at DCM Insights, has held executive leadership positions in product strategy, research, and advisory, as well as enablement. He's worked for organizations like Tether, Russell Runners Associates, CB, which is now part of Gartner. He is an accomplished sales and customer experience researcher who has worked and appeared in the pages of Harvard Business Review. And Ted is also the co-author of one of my favorite books with Matt Dixon, The JOLT Effect. Ted, welcome to Winning the Challenger Sale.
Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yes, it is wonderful to have you. I've had Matt on, now I get to have Ted on, so this is so exciting. Best way to kick off the new year. So Ted, as I mentioned, you and Matt published the JOLT Effect back in September 2022, and that was based on research from the pandemic era. How has the landscape shifted and customer indecision become even more of the forefront since then?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something we've been kind of curious about too. I've been out talking to a whole bunch of sales organizations in the last couple of months to ask that same type of question. In what way is indecision still playing out for you all? I think, when we wrote the book and when we wrote the study, we knew that there were a whole bunch of secular reasons why indecision
Yep.
would continue rising. We talk in the book about the role that information plays and the number of options we all put up for our customers and a whole
Mhm.
bunch of reasons why we think for secular reasons this will continue to rise. But I think over the last 18 months or so, the macroeconomic environment has only exacerbated, some of these trends.
Yeah.
And that's particularly true, I think, in technology circles and in SaaS circles where
Yep.
budgets have been very tight, lots of eyeballs on less and less money going around to spend, which creates more scrutiny and more pressure. And all of those things, I think, have created an environment where people feel like the easiest thing to do is just do nothing. And so you
Yeah.
see more and more of those deals kind of getting stalled out and stuck in the pipeline. I don't think it has reduced, at least in my view, I don't think it has reduced kind of the what I'd call the curiosity of the buyer. So
Yeah, for
it
sure.
seems like
Yeah.
people are still quite willing to take visits, and actually that's a double-edged sword because
I was just gonna say they fill your pipeline and then then it's more work.
you have great visits, you have great demos, it feels like everyone's kind of vibing, and then they go cold, and you're left scratching your head as to why
Yeah,
that might be. But yeah, that's kind of how what we see is there are a bunch of reasons why this will keep happening for human reasons and also purchase environment reasons that are going to go away. But then right now, I think with budgets being the way that they are, it just feels even more acute for certain teams.
yeah, absolutely. And I know obviously you and I talk about this a lot, but Challenger is really at the heart of it, a behavior change.
Hmm.
And you and Matt found, talk about this psychological effect called emission bias. And, emission bias drives a lot of this customer decision. Can you kind of unpack what is emission bias? How would you describe it? How do you see it playing out in this customer decision?
Yeah. So emission bias, of course, is something that is a psychological effect and was found by Kahneman and Tversky and a bunch of other psychologists much smarter than us that have developed all sorts of experiments to prove this out. But what we found when we studied this in sales environments, when sellers are dealing with buyers, is the same type of phenomenon was happening here, and helped us to understand why did we see so many situations happen where it felt like buyer was excited to move forward, they had stated their intent to purchase. They'd even selected the vendor. The seller was doing all the things you would have expected and hoped them to have been
Yeah.
doing, and yet still this deal was stalling out. And so when you look at the research of what's going on, called omission bias, there's a loss aversion that we're all quite
Mhm.
familiar with, right? That's the reason why so many of us have relied for years on that fear of missing out as the attempt to try to drive persuasion, to drive excitement and urgency in the sale. You try to help the buyer
Right.
understand that burning platform and the reason why they need to move forward. And of course, the core challenger methodology is a terrific way to help the buyer on that front. But that's why it works, is because of loss aversion, right? But it turns out in that research, there's actually two different types of losses that weigh on us. There's the loss of the error of omission, which is I did not do something, and as a consequence, I missed out. I didn't invest in crypto, and my friends did, and they got rich, and now I'm really jealous of them. But then there's the error of commission, which is that I did do something, it went horribly
Right.
wrong, and I got blamed. And
Right.
that second loss really weighs quite heavily and is very relevant with respect to indecision, especially on buyers, who've had past regrets from purchases that they've made, and it weighs on them, or they worry about their company's ability to achieve some of those outcomes that we're
Yeah.
talking through. It's a whole series of things that I worry that, look, even if we did this, I'm not sure we could achieve it. And if we can't, there's one person's name on
I
the
was right
chopping
now
block.
on the line. Yep. Yep.
Exactly right. Yep. So it's left to the seller to kind of navigate this notion of helping the buyer with overcome this fear. It's quite different, of course, with when you're trying to help the buyer understand why change is necessary. In many ways, we have to dial up the fear of what happens if you don't
Right.
do anything. But then, in the same respect, we have to be careful with that fear. We can't throw more fear on top of an already scared and terrified
Exactly.
buyer. And
Exactly.
that's where the sort of reducing fear, helping them overcome those indecision fears, becomes a big component to getting through to a decision.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know we had Matt on the podcast last year and he talked a lot about judging this indecision, what you were just
Hmm.
talking about. And I think that's the hard part, right? Is judging that customer's like level of indecision and like, often to your point, customers don't openly talk about their fears of failure with salespeople, right? You really have
Unfortunately
to
not, yeah.
dive deep into this. And as salespeople, like we're not psychologists, like, right, we try and but we're not their therapists, right? So I think, how do the best salespeople, to your point, like use fear, but not too much fear. And so they can really build that trust and make these conversations a little bit easier.
Yeah. Well, to your point, it is really tricky because the buyer doesn't just come out and tell you, "Hey, I really stink at making decisions," and
Yeah.
and I think sometimes this is something that they themselves don't even fully appreciate as to why
Mm-hmm.
this is happening, or that this is kind of holding them up. It becomes almost like an obstacle on an emotional level to this purchase, even though rationally they're excited about the
Right. Right.
concept.
And they know they need it.
Um,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've always found powerful about this research is that people should be able to identify it with it on a personal level. It's one of
Mm-hmm.
the only areas I think in B2B sales, as a researcher of B2B sales, it's not common you can draw on personal experiences to then help explain what's happening in B2B purchases when you're spending other people's money and there's lots of other people involved. But the fear of messing up is something all of us have dealt with.
Yeah.
Uh, I'll raise my hand. I deal with it all the time, and personal purchases, ranging in lots of different ways. And so I think for that reason, one of the first pieces of advice I would give sellers is like, think about how you can self-identify with what the buyer might be going through at that moment, because you yourself have felt this,
Yeah.
maybe not in the exact same way or in the exact same depth, but you've dealt with this before. There are then skills I think the buyer or the seller needs to learn as a way to surface those fears. We can't just hope and assume that it's not there just because the buyer isn't telling
Right.
us
Right.
explicitly,
Exactly.
"Hey, I'm really worried about this." We know in our research that the predominant fears are sort of popping up in there. 87% of opportunities have either moderate or high levels of
Mm-hmm.
indecision, and so we've got to treat it in some respect. There's a skill we talk about. It's actually not in the book. We kept doing research as researchers would do
Yeah.
after we hit send to the publisher, partly because we want to understand more about getting past kind of the concept of what these skills are. How does a seller get better at these things over time? And the concept we came up with for judging level of decision, Matt probably talked about on the last time, is pings and echoes. So your
Mm-hmm.
ability to sort of ping the buyer and understand what's going on under the surface of the water, if you will, trying to understand the size and depth and breadth of that indecision, and using that to inform both how I think about the quality of this opportunity and then also the type of indecision they have. Now I can treat it, knowing more, I can treat it in a better way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then the echo pieces, is that really just like making sure you're actively listening to what they're saying? And I know sometimes the salespeople, we like to do a lot of the talking. So,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah, it is trying to understand the reflection back. So
Yeah.
yes,
Yep.
there's active listening involved, but I think it's key for people to understand that sometimes it's okay even if you get the ping wrong. Like part of what you're trying to do is just have an honest, transparent conversation about, hey, I think this is what's going on here. Am I right here? Am I off here? And I think you get credit for even trying, even if you're slightly off base.
Yeah.
And what you're just
Yeah.
looking for is a little bit of honesty and reflection back from the buyer. What you're hoping for actually is what feels like almost like relief from the buyer. Like, oh, thank God.
Yeah. Like, thank you
I'm
for
so
identifying that.
glad that we can now talk about this because yes, this
Right.
actually is. And so it's a little bit of a, yeah, it is active listening, but it's also, I think, hopefully kind of bringing more oxygen into the conversation, if you will, with the buyer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, if you tie that back to the challenger methodology, right, the piece of like taking control of the sales cycle, I think this is a really good point where you really, I think what sellers who do well during customer decision, part of this is if you take control of the sales cycle, so that teach Taylor, take control of the sales cycle. By taking control, you really earn the right to one, have this conversation, and two, like you're owning this because you can't wait to your point for the sale for the person, your prospect to be like, hey, by the way, I'm having all these feelings, right? And all this,
Yeah,
concern. And, they're not necessarily going to bring it up. And this is where I think that the sellers who really, to me, stand out in this area are the ones who will bring it up and feel like they can take control of that sales cycle to bring it up.
I think so. In many respects, you could say that some of the things we learned, I think, especially around the L and the limiting the expiration, expanded a little bit of our understanding of what take control can mean,
Hmm.
across the customer journey. Um, you know, Going back to my early sort of challenger research days, very much of taking control was about managing tension and doing so constructively, and of course, you all have taken that and applied it in a way to the sales process that's super practical and helpful. There's a skill in the limiting the expiration called owning the flow of information, which is essentially, to your point, kind of navigating that process with the buyer, but doing so in a way where you're the orchestrator of the experience, and you do that because you're trying to earn that trust. Exactly to your point. But then there's times when once you've earned that it's okay to spend that trust, is the way we kind of think
Hmm.
about it. So there's a skill we talk about in a book called radical candor, which of course is not a concept
Yes.
that we came up
Love
with,
that
but
beginner. Yeah. Yeah. Love the book.
applied in this concept,
Yeah.
right? That is
Yeah.
essentially the seller spending that trust that they've now earned. It's kind of like calling time out. Like, hold on, is that seventh demo really going to make the biggest difference here? Like, do you really like what are you trying to accomplish with this
Right.
12th reference call? So sort of calling time out and having that sort of honest conversation, I think it truly is a manifestation of kind of taking control, to your point.
Yeah, and I think that's like a good point too. Like when the customer is asking for the 12th demo or the 12th reference call, or like they are clearly like identifying that they're clearly having some issues around this, right? And some, that's I think also being able to flag those and say, hey, you know what, I'm a little concerned about where this deal is going just based on that those types
Yeah.
of behaviors.
Yeah, calling a spade a spade. Let's
Right.
be honest
Right.
here. And if they don't recognize that, by the way, yeah, and they might not, which would be sad, but but nonetheless,
All
could
our
be
attention
true.
goes to nothing.
Yeah, no, but I think you get credit a little bit for being an
Right.
honest broker, in the moment.
Yeah, yeah. So, we've talked about some of the ways that, high performers do this. What are examples of like safety net options that, if you're a high performing rep, you can say, hey, and you just talked about it, like, hey, I know you're feeling uncertain around this, but here's some ideas around, making you feel more comfortable with this decision. Obviously, to your point, the pinging piece, understanding, under the surface, what's happening and
Hmm.
the depth and breadth of what's really happening in their organization. But are there other things that reps can say like, hey, here's a way to make you feel a little bit safer about this
Yeah,
decision?
I think the first step here is, you know, there were two skills in the taking risk off the table chapter and that part of the study, and de-risking and sort of downside protection was one of them. The place I like to take teams first, though, is don't forget about the power of just simple expectation setting. It
Hmm.
actually turns out of all the skills in our model, it was the single biggest impact that you had if you were to execute that expectation setting well. I think in many respects, the concept of expectation setting is sort of like a no duh. Like, of course, you
Right,
should
right.
be doing this. What happens though in practice is that we do it too late. We wait
Mm-hmm.
until the buyer is already set in their mind about what they want to do and what they're trying to achieve and what they think is possible, and then we start trying to ratchet back if we start to feel like they're sort of getting out ahead of
Yeah.
themselves
Yeah.
on that point. But so it's about some of it's about starting earlier, but there is real value in from the beginning making sure that the buyer's expectations are grounded in practical, achievable outcomes, things
Right.
that feel like are doable, which is tough for that buyer who gets really excited. I think especially true in sort of a true challenger sale where you've done your job to disrupt their point of view and get them excited about this new potential vision, which can feel very transformative and super invigorating. But we also have to be careful about making sure that we're at least helping them understand the vision in a way such that it feels like achievable in bit by
Right.
bit,
Right.
if you will. So that's the first thing, is expectations being done well, I think can feel like a safety net for the buyer because you're helping them understand why this is achievable and how this is achievable and that you can do this as an organization. The other thing that I've found to be a useful, because in the book we talk about a whole series of potential safety nets that you could break out in those situations when it
Right.
feels like,
Right.
hey, they're never going to make a decision unless you use some sort of safety net. And there's ranging from starting small to
Yeah.
professional services to there's different things that are useful for different contexts and different industries. Even like I think some of these things are going to differ a little bit by company.
Yeah. Absolutely.
There was an example though that somebody gave to us a couple months ago that I thought was just a great one, which is, and actually it demonstrates how these skills can kind of tie together when done well. Because when I tell you this example, you're going to say this sounds like this sounds like offering a recommendation, but when done well, it also has the dual purpose of a safety net. So what they came up with was, look, if the job to be done here is to reduce the probability of a mess up,
Mm-hmm.
in the buyer's mind, like this, we're going to mess this up. We mess these things up all the time. So if I want to reduce in their minds the probability of that mess up, then what I want to start with, what I want to anchor them on, is what they would think of as like a child-proofed solution.
Right.
So, like, what's a version of your product that feels like you couldn't possibly mess this thing up, even if you tried? Right? It's got like
Right.
rubber corners. It's got packing tape. Like you could
Yeah.
drop this thing and it's perfectly fine, like no problem at all. And everyone's got a version of their product usually that
Right.
has that, right? That reduces some of the dependencies, reduces some of the variables involved, reduces the risk that things might go wrong. Start there, and kind of go from there. So there's examples I can kind of talk through of that, but I think that's kind of a very powerful thing because now I can have an honest conversation of, yeah, sure, you can add these things on,
Right.
or you could go here in year two, but when you do that, just be aware, yeah, there are some unknowns that come into play. There's some dependencies that come into play, and because of that, you're going to have to invest resources, you're going to invest time, and so now you're having an honest conversation about what it would take to get to that outcome. But you're starting from a place of you couldn't possibly mess this up. You're fine. Everything's going to be
Right.
okay.
Do you think that that affects deal size? So, I mean, I'm thinking like pilots, right? For example, like, hey, try it. This won't get messed up, and then you can expand more. Do you think that this is causing, maybe this indecision is causing people to do more like pilots or smaller groups, or I'm just curious around deal size.
I think it's possible. I
Yeah.
would argue that that has already been happening from
Yeah.
buyers for
Yeah.
years. Asking expectations for free pilots and POCs, I
Yep.
think has been on the rise for many years. Um, but it doesn't have to be about deal size or price. So I'll give you an example of a good safety net I found that actually had no impact on price or deal size. This is from without revealing the company. It was a
Yes.
company that's
Okay.
selling software to like CFOs, and
Hmm.
one of the features of their product was about automating outreach to customers and vendors and that type of thing. It was just one feature amongst many others. And while that was a very valuable thing that could save them a bunch of time and
Right.
reduce a bunch of and make their whole process more accurate and what have you, it also felt a little risky to the CFO because it's an uncontrollable thing. Like, what if they react poorly to the scripting in there? What if,
Yeah.
you could start imagining all the blowback I'm going to get
Right.
if
Like a
that
bot just
thing.
sent me an email. Why are the
Yeah,
people not
e-
doing it? Yes. Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
So what they what they
AI is taking over the world.
what they decided was, what if we just tell them don't turn on that feature for the first year.
Hmm.
And what's interesting about that is it didn't change the price of the product at
Interesting.
all. It actually did. make the implementation a lot easier because now you don't have to go and find the names of those customers and the vendors and all that stuff and put them in there. So it actually sped up the implementation process. But for the buyer, it felt like, okay, you've now reduced some of the variables I can imagine going wrong here. And so I just thought it was a good example of same product, but you're just thinking through like, what's the advice I'd give them as they go to implement this in a way that
Yeah.
reduces the risk that they perceive? Because often this risk of mess up is more perceived than actual,
Right.
right? And so we
Right.
have to kind of work through helping them to reduce that perception.
Yeah. Do you feel that, also saying if you don't buy this, what's the alternative? Like that whole cost of inaction, do you kind of use that as well? Or do you stay away from that and just really focus on, to your point, that more the safety net of just, hey, this there's no way this will get messed up.
I think you got to balance it
Yeah.
and be careful. The what we started to kind of think about is there's you should be asking at all times like is my buyer indifferent or are they indecisive?
Yep.
Because indifference, whether they're indifferent about your problem that you're trying to solve or you as the preferred supplier, that's if there's still indifference at play. That's where I think the cost of inaction can be a very
Yeah.
powerful motivator. But if it's indecision, we know through research that can backfire in those situations,
Yeah.
throwing, fear that, hey, you're really going to miss out on what's going on with your competitors or what have you. You're just throwing fear on top of fear.
Yep.
It would look to have enough fear to initiate action, but not so much that they get scared
Yeah.
off in those situations. And I recognize that's a subjective level, and it's going to take a little bit of work with your manager to think through where are we at here. But that's where I'd start with: is are they indifferent or are they indecisive?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great distinction, right? I actually never thought about that. Like this whole idea of like, right, are they indifferent? And here are, if they're indifferent, here are the actions I take, and if they're indecisive, here are the actions I
Hmm.
take. And I think to your point, like being able to identify the difference between your buyers, I think is so critical because sometimes you don't know, and being able to ask those questions and really nail down which one it is.
Totally.
No, I love that. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, in 2023, just recently, you and your colleagues at DCMI co-authored an article in the Harvard Business Review on selling strategies in professional services. And you call the activator, as you guys call it, share a lot of the behaviors with our challenger seller profile. In your opinion, how does this align, like selling like a challenger, but also how is it different in professional services?
So it was a really interesting process to be a part of that study, having been there in sort of in the early days of the Challenger, and then kind of seeing a specific segment of customers and sellers in a different environment. So if you think about
Mhm.
professional
Yeah,
services, you're a lawyer, you're an accountant, you're a consultant, you're a banker, and you are the product, right? So
yeah,
you're not selling other things. You're not passing this off to a services team. You don't have a customer success team or an account management team. You are the product. And so it's a very different sale, that's more trust based and sort of longer term relationship that you're looking to establish over time and kind of grow over time. And so it was that's what we set out to sort of determine is
yeah,
in those environments, what are the things that win? And of course we had some hypotheses just based on past research, the power of insight, for example, and the way in which you might look to teach customers and what have you. What we found is, so of the five profiles that we found, the activator was one of the five profiles, and we found that to be the one that was by far and away the winner. There are elements of what the activator is doing that you'll look at and say, yeah, challengers do that as well. So they're bringing new ideas with regularity. Um, they're sort of generating and distributing insight. So they're open to making sure that they're put good ideas on their customers' radar, irrespective of whether they're the author of it or not. And they're thoughtful about how they can contextualize that for those in their network. There's a whole bunch of things the activator is doing that the challenger research would have said is different. Part of it, I think, is a reflection of the market that they work in and how they
mhm,
look to establish those relationships at events and what have you. There was a separate profile though that we called the debater. That I think when you look at the debater, there are probably some elements, particularly around kind of taking control,
mhm,
that would spike there. It's the person who is looking to make sure they are the right person, and the client, feels like maybe they were the wrong person. I'm
Yeah.
looking for you to follow my lead, for example. And what we found in professional services, in situations where you are the product, that wasn't quite as successful over time. And I think when you
Hmm.
interview buyers and interview um, uh, rainmakers, if you will, in those settings, the actual doer sellers in those moments, what I think you start to appreciate is, look, good ideas are great, but if it's coming through stylistically as a contrarian all of the time,
Yeah.
over a long standing relationship where we're trying to collaborate on big things, it just gets a little tiresome, over time. And so I think it's a little bit of a stylistic difference there. But nonetheless, I think there are definitely things the activator is doing that are challenger like, in the sense that
Hmm.
the way to look to kind of use insight. But there's a whole series of other things they're doing to connect with clients on an ongoing basis, to create value in very specific ways for people in their network. And they also they sort of commit to business development, and create a daily habit, or weekly habits out of this. So a whole series of things that speak more to the kind of the process of being an activator, and the way in which you think about cultivating and growing your network over time, that would kind of sit separate from what a sort of
Yeah.
traditional challenger might do.
Right, because from our perspective, right, the relationship seller, which obviously in professional services that is a little bit different because they are salespeople. Obviously, we're all in sales, but they're more focused on probably, but to your point, building that relationship. So then, how do you build that network and that relationship, and knowing, I come from professional services, so knowing how important those relationships are on top of all the other things, probably I could see the differentiator there.
Yeah, you've got to do right by, I guess, that relationship. But
Yeah.
it takes a little bit, to back to the trust factor. There's actually, I think, some overlap between there's a chapter in the JOLT Effect called Becoming Buyer's Agent,
Hmm.
that I think speaks a little bit to some of the types of things that the activator is doing. Not all of them, because there was another profile that we call the realist. That if you had just read the Jolt Effect and that was the only thing you ever read, you would have thought the realist would have won, because the realist is the
Right.
person
Right.
who's just the honest
Yeah,
broker,
right,
And it turns out that sometimes that feels a little too realistic, or
right,
too
right.
sort of,
People want to live a little bit in their own,
yeah, it's a glass half
dystopian.
empty sort of
Yeah, yeah,
view. Like,
yeah.
you can only do this. Like, what if I want to try to do some ambitious things? So.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's definitely a balance. So no, I appreciate that. So as we start to close out this conversation, which has been awesome, by the way, you've got so much wisdom to it. What are you thinking? Like, I mean, I know you guys are always on top of like researching, the next big thing, or
Mhm.
really what's going on in the world. What is kind of the biggest change you see in sales and marketing, in the universe in the next, say, 12 to 18 months, given the macroeconomic conditions, given the uncertainty around, the Middle East, the Ukraine, right? Like just everything
Yeah.
that's essentially happening in our world, in the U.S., an election coming up, not too far away. What are you thinking from a research perspective, or like what's coming up from the sales and marketing universe?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I can't speak. I'm no expert on world
Yes,
affairs,
I know.
but
I wish we were.
yeah,
I wish all of us knew,
I
right?
know,
Had a
I
crystal
know,
ball.
I know. But I do think, there's kind of two uber arching things that are kind of on our radar. Um, One of them we've touched on in a couple of different ways, but it feels like trust between buyer and seller is at an all-time low,
Hmm.
for a whole host of reasons. I think, in general, trust in institutions, I think,
Yeah,
it's been demonstrated in general to be on the secular decline. And I think there's a whole a whole bundle of reasons, if you will, why the buyer, I hear all the time, like, what it is true for almost every sales organization is the buyer is just constantly asking for proof of
yep,
ROI. So it's like, I want to smell it, feel it, touch it. Like, you can tell me that all you want, that your case studies are a thing, but I need to experience it before I
yeah,
actually will trust it. We can debate whether that's true, that they actually don't trust it, or if it's just their instinct to ask for it. But nonetheless, I think trust is an all-time low. So I'm very curious as a researcher, how do the best sellers navigate in that environment? And we've touched on it in a couple different ways, but probably not in as much depth as we can. The second thing, I think, is more about the tooling and the way we think about enabling our sellers. AI, I think, will
yeah,
play out in ways that we can't even really fully anticipate. what I think is exciting, we had another piece in HBR a couple weeks ago as well about using AI at the front line. And I think that's one of the big differences that's happened over the last year or so with Gen AI and some of these other tools that are starting to get into unstructured data sources that are now useful for the front line. I mean, for years, leadership has had access to
Yeah.
AI and machine learning tooling inside CRM systems
Yeah.
and other forecasting and all sorts of ways in which they could take advantage of those things. But now the power of Gen AI on unstructured data, putting them right in the hands of sellers for good or bad. You know, the
Yeah.
hallucinations I think are a thing that are gonna people are gonna have to work through.
Yeah.
But it's exciting, and I think there's a lot of potential, even for things like building models for training practice and ways in which you can improve their effectiveness there. There's a lot of potential that we'll be interested to observe, and I'm not exactly sure where it's all going to go, but excited to kind of see where we can aim some research at some point.
Yeah, no, and it's kind of interesting, right? Like when I think about AI and I think about trust, it's almost like they're polar opposites, right? Like I think so it's interesting you brought up those two because in my head I think about AI is like everything's bots. Do you trust AI? There's obviously people are like, are they taking over our job? There's a lot of like skepticism, I would say, around
Yeah,
AI. I'm a tech person. I actually like love AI, the idea of AI, but I know that freaks people out quite a bit. And then you think about trust, right? And even when you think about AI and like, the macro world, right? AI generating fake news, generating ads or things, right? So
yeah,
it,
yeah,
it is
yeah.
really complicated, right? Because to your point, we're introducing AI and trust is at an all-time low. And it's
Yeah.
almost like those are like two really tough things to kind of bring together. So
I think for that reason, the what will win out is, I think, private models or hybrid models are going to
yeah,
rule the day, and I'd argue probably some of the platforms that we all know who have deep pockets are going to sort of be the ones who are integrating them into user experiences in ways that will be really powerful, whether it's Salesforce or LinkedIn or what have you. There's going to be applications there that get really useful. But a funny story for you on the trust piece. This is actually
yeah,
pretty hilarious. So a colleague of mine took the article we wrote about AI and sales and ran it through one of the engines. I can't remember which one it
okay,
was. It doesn't really matter which one for this purpose, because I think any one of them would have done something
yep,
like this. And it asked it to summarize the key takeaways of the article. And two of the summary the points of summary were completely wrong. Didn't have anything to do with
oh,
the article at
interesting,
all. One of them was completely made up about the safety and ethics of AI, and you really need to be careful about the guidelines and usage of AI, which made me think, are they training these bots just to be like on a meta level, tell
right?
people that, hey, be careful using this thing? It was like there was nothing in the article at all about AI safety or ethics or anything. It
That's
just
so
didn't apply in
fascinating.
that situation, but it just populated that as if like it's a disclaimer that they always put there or something.
Oh my God, that's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would think of anything but the opposite. Like this is great. Like yeah,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Trust everything. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, exactly. That's really fascinating. Well, as we know, AI is still evolving. So
Yes.
so yeah. Well, Ted, this was awesome. Thank you so much. What's the best way for our listeners to connect with you and hear more about all your research and your work?
Yeah, well, find me on LinkedIn. Love
Yeah.
connecting with people is a quick way, but DCMinsights.com is our homepage. JOLTEffect.com, of course, also a place you can go and find more detail on the book. And of course, partners like Challenger Inc. We can connect through you all as well.
Yes, yes, we are big fans of Jolt. We love our product around Jolt. So yes, connect with us, connect with Ted. And to all of our listeners, remember that understanding and addressing indecision is vital to winning those critical sales moments. Like I said, if you want to learn more, check out the book, The Jolt Effect, or learn more at challengerinc.com. We even have a landing page, so /Jolt. We put links to the show notes as well. So also make sure you're following our show on your favorite podcast platform. Connect with us on social media, share your thoughts and experiences. We'd love to hear from you. Until then, happy selling, and we hope that all of you have a winning Q1.